Hello, and welcome to the Community IT Innovators Technology Topics Podcast, where we discuss nonprofit technology, cybersecurity, tech project implementation, strategic planning, and nonprofit IT careers. Find us at communityit.com.
Thank you for joining Community IT for this podcast, Part 1. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits. Listen for Part 2 in your podcast feed.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to the October 2021 Community IT Innovators webinar. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the cybersecurity self-assessment. Today, we're going to explore your risk assessment and cybersecurity preparedness options based on our just released cybersecurity self-assessment, which you can find on our website and which we will be sending a link out to shortly. This self-assessment will help nonprofit organizations document their cybersecurity readiness. My name is Johan Hammerstrom, and I'm the CEO of Community IT and the moderator for this webinar series. The slides and recording for today's webinar will be available on our website and YouTube channel later this week. If you're watching on YouTube right now, we encourage you to subscribe to our channel so that you can receive automatic updates when we post new webinar recordings each month. We invite you to use the Q&A panel throughout today's webinar to ask questions, and we will do our best to respond. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our company. Community IT is a 100% employee-owned company, and our team of 38 staff is dedicated to helping nonprofit organizations advance their missions through the effective use of technology. We're technology experts, and we have been consistently named a top 501 managed services provider by Channel Futures, and it's an honor that we received again for 2020. And now, it's my pleasure to welcome our Chief Technology Officer, cybersecurity expert, and resident thought leader in the area of nonprofit cybersecurity, Matthew Eshelman. Good afternoon, Matt.
Hey, good afternoon, Johan. Thanks for the intro. It's, and I'm thankful for all of you who are joining today. This is October. It's Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And so we're bringing this session to you today to talk a little bit about how to go through our cybersecurity self-assessment. And I think more importantly than going through the assessment is understanding the recommendations and making a plan for how your organization can get those plans implemented. So we are going to be talking about a couple things today during our session. So one is just the overview of the cybersecurity landscape. Again, I think it's always good to level set and understand the kind of the IT world that we're operating in. We'll talk about some controls that are identified in the assessment, and then talk about how to prioritize implementation and then engage leadership. I think there's so many different assessment tools out there and surveys and frameworks. And so there's no shortage of knowing what to do. I think the real gap is in implementation and execution. And so we'll talk a little bit about how to pick some things, how to engage your leadership, and how to really move forward with the implementation. So as Johan said, we want this to be a conversation. Please use the chat and the Q&A features. Johan will be moderating that, and we'll be taking questions as they come in the session. So please feel free to go ahead and chat those in so that we can answer any questions that come up as you think about them. So let's first start off by talking a little bit about the cybersecurity landscape. This is the world that we're operating in now, where we see persistent and ongoing brute force attacks on identities. So if you've been following the releases from Microsoft, there have been a number of different threat actors that have been conducting password spray attacks against Office 365. And so this is something that we see in the security systems that we monitor, is that there's just ongoing authentication attempts against any cloud-based system. So again, if you can log into it from the cloud, the bad guys can too, and they're actively doing so and trying to log in. We're also seeing very sophisticated spear phishing attacks being perpetrated, where you may get those emails that look like they're coming from somebody within the organization or maybe even a partner organization that you work with, and then try to get you to maybe click on a link, share your password, buy a gift card, update some financial information, and they look very convincing. So that's something that we've seen a real increase on in the last year or so. We're also seeing organizations targeted because of the work that they do. So, organizations in the think tank and policy space, I think, are particularly targeted right now. We're also seeing, attacks against healthcare, even education. So again, nonprofit organizations don't get to fly under the radar because they're doing good work. Organizations, are kind of targeted because of the work that they're doing. And then finally, we're also seeing attacks targeting vendors. So vendors like managed service providers such as ourselves, because of the access that we have, are our favorite targets of these attackers. And so it's important that as you're working with a vendor, you have a good understanding of the security controls that they have in place to protect your information. It's not all necessarily bad news. The good news is that there are lots of good security tools available to help combat these threat types. You've taken a really good step in terms of coming to the webinar to learn a little bit more. Maybe you've already taken that self-assessment, and so we certainly see a lot more proactive steps from the clients that we work with to asking about how they can implement good security controls at their organization, what steps they need to take. And so I think that's really encouraging. But we know that we still have a lot of work to do. And I think that was judged by the survey results that we saw. I don't think we had very many people that had the big smiley face that said, yes, we're doing all that we need to do in the area of cybersecurity protection. So again, there's lots more work to do. And I think there's also a real financial impact to this as well. We see the stat here that, a breach response for a small to mid-sized business is about $149,000. That's real money. I think the other thing that we've seen in the last 6 months in particular, as it relates to cyber liability insurance renewals, is that those prices are going up. They're going up steeply. And they're also mandating significant cybersecurity controls to be in place to even be considered for a policy. So if you have a renewal coming up, I think you need to be aware that the controls that you may not have had to say yes to, you will now need to be able to say yes to. So I think the cyber insurance business has gotten burned, and so they're reacting to that with increased requirements for controls, and then also raising prices as well. And again, as I I'll reiterate, is that just because you're a nonprofit organization doesn't mean that you get to fly under the radar. So your organization has data that is valuable, and that could be specific information like what's shown here in terms of credit card or customer PII or medical information if you're in that space. But it also could be other financial loss that occurs due to fraud. And so we've seen recent examples of this related to email compromise that turned into wire fraud. So again, updating bank transfer information. We've also seen cases of gift card fraud. And while we haven't been able to find a direct correlation between any compromise on a system that we've maintained, we've also seen a spike in unemployment fraud. And so this is kind of new to me in terms of the fraud associated with unemployment claims, but that's where an employee's identity is stolen somehow. Not necessarily clear how, but then an unemployment claim is filed, and then the state office then reaches out to the employer to confirm the status and then follow up. So this is something that has increased pretty dramatically as part of COVID. And so Angie Barnett, who's the president of the Better Business Bureau of Maryland, Greater Maryland, said that in some estimates, this type of fraud has gone up over 3,000% since the coronavirus pandemic, and catching and prosecuting these criminals is really tough. So I know I've been on the reacting side whenever we have a client say, hey, we were contacted by our state labor department to investigate this claim of unemployment. Can you investigate what happened? And so we're involved in kind of responding to those incidents as well. And it's because of the data that is stolen. Again, it could be from the organization, or it could be other areas where an identity may be stolen, but that really translates into real money, into real financial loss. And I think it's important to understand that these hackers aren't just some genius hacker in the basement that knows 15% of your password that's trying to get into the system, but these are organized criminal enterprises. So again, the cybersecurity adversaries that you face, are examples here, like we see here Fancy Bear. So that kind of got a lot of press as part of the DNC hack back in 2016. Cozy Bear, also a Russian-backed entity that was involved in the SolarWinds hack. And then we have the other adversary here, which is not necessarily a nation state, but more of a criminal enterprise, the ReEvil group that has been responsible or associated with a number of ransomware attacks recently, the Colonial Pipeline, among others, where networks were infected with a crypto virus, all the files were locked, and then a ransom was demanded in order to get that data back. So again, that's something that happens to big companies, but it's also something that happens to small organizations as well. I was talking with a colleague today, and he said that his local newspaper actually was a victim of a crypto attack just in the last week, and it really just crippled their ability to put out a newspaper. And so this is something where no organization is immune from attack. It doesn't matter if you're a Colonial Pipeline or a local print company, a local education, Department of Education, all are vulnerable and susceptible to these types of attacks. So in terms of how we take all this bad news and scary things and turn it into actionable steps for nonprofit organizations to take, is really by building a foundation of security policy and awareness. We really try to start with that view of a policy roadmap, educating and training the staff at organization, and then building on top of that with the technology tools that fill in these blue blocks here as well. Once we have our foundation established, then it may be appropriate to add on some additional sophisticated tools to provide that extra layer of protection. And we draw that from what we put out for the past 3 years, which is our nonprofit cybersecurity incident report. So this is a report that we've developed because as a managed service provider, we support over 140 different organizations. We support about over 5,000 users. And so we get a lot of information through our help desk in terms of the types of attacks nonprofits are facing. And we can see over the years that the number of security incidents that we record has really gone up dramatically. So, back in 2018, we recorded 233 incidents. 2019, that number went up to just over 500 incidents. In 2020, that was almost 700 incidents. And so that helps us take a data-driven approach to guide our cybersecurity recommendations. So in addition to the data that we see coming through our service desk, we also use common industry standards such as the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and the Center for Internet Security's V8 controls that, if you're a policy wonk, that used to be called, referred to as the 20 critical security controls. Now there's only 18. I think they've actually done a good job in the revision and making it a little bit more applicable to smaller organizations. But again, they provide some good high-level guidance, but I do think that they end up being a little bit overly cumbersome for the smaller and more cloud-centric networks that we see in the small and mid-sized nonprofit clients that we work with. And so applying those big frameworks to your organization just may be a little bit too complicated or not relevant. And so that's why with the assessment that we put out in that survey, it really is a stripped down and focused version so that you can get started on manageable steps to really address the most likely risks to your network. So let's go ahead and take a look at those specific sections in the survey and talk a little bit more about the details and then where you can get started. So, so a if you can, we'll just go ahead and take a look here. And as I said, we really start with policy. So I think policy, it's maybe not always the most entertaining thing to talk about, but the policy really should form the foundation of your cybersecurity controls. So this provides the framework to make other decisions that layer on top of that. So we have an entire webinar and podcast devoted to this policy elements that you can check out. So Johan will be chatting out the link to that, where I really go into a deep dive on the policy creation process and the details associated with each of those elements. But I will say that, most organizations, and whenever I'm doing consulting engagements with clients, I will say that most organizations do need to refresh this as their IT acceptable use policy. It's likely part of the employee handbook. It was developed a long time ago, and it really isn't reflective of the organization and how they work now in terms of being flexible and cloud-centric, as many nonprofit networks are now. I think that was one of the striking things that I noticed in the survey data. Of all the people that have taken the assessment now, only one organization has data on-premise, solely on-premise. Every other organization was entirely in the cloud or was in a hybrid environment. And so I think that's evocative of what we see as well, is that we've taken a cloud-centric approach for quite a long time. And nonprofit organizations, I think, benefit from the donations from Google and Office 365, among others. And I think that's really been a benefit. But I think it also means that our policy work often is not reflective of kind of the current operating environment. So I would also encourage organizations to go through that policy development process and use it as an opportunity to identify all of those IT and information systems that are in use and catalog the data that's stored in each one of them. So it's also a good opportunity to have a discussion around the device status of the organization. I think this is another thing is we found, because of COVID and the work from home and the use of cloud platforms, that many organizations have relied on personal devices, either personal computers and mobile devices, and it's been viewed as a nice benefit. And that may be okay, but it's good to talk through some of those different scenarios to see how your organization would react. So again, somebody syncs your organization's Dropbox folder to their personal home computer, and then they leave the organization. What impact would that potentially have? Same scenario could be somebody has, all the organization, your development director has their email on their personal phone. They leave the organization. What happens to all those contacts, calendar, email addresses as they leave the organization? Is that okay? Is there any concern about that data going away? Or would your organization want to have or need to have some sort of controls that say, hey, whenever you leave, we're going to wipe data from that device? Or if your device is lost or stolen, we need to have some way to prove that it can't be accessed by somebody that picked up the computer, that acquired it maliciously or by accident. And so I think that's having some of those real world cases helps to make this stuff come to life. And so I think we've all appreciated having the flexibility of these cloud-based platforms. We've all appreciated the ability to access new services, but I think at the same time, it's good to ask those questions. What happens in these scenarios? What do we need to have as an organization in place to protect our data, which is our most important asset? So I think that really starts and can be included as part of the IT acceptable use policy. The next bullet on there talks about a data privacy policy. Again, one thing that I typically see is that this policy tends to be a little bit more up to date. This often comes through the web or data side of the organization. So this tends to be more up to date, and it really talks about how your organization is handling the data that you receive from your constituents, from your donors, and what are the protections and expectations that somebody would have whenever they fill out a donation form or sign up to volunteer. How is that data going to be used? What expectations can that individual have around the privacy controls of that data? So oftentimes, again, this is a separate document and would be informed by the various data systems that you're using, and would, could potentially also be informed by some external compliance standards. So for example, if you do need to be aware of GDPR, or there's some California data privacy or New York standards, those would be applicable here or help inform those policies. So again, the data privacy policy would be a separate document that would be often developed to support those platforms where you're storing information about constituents, volunteers, other stakeholders of the organization. And then the final policy document that we think is a key element of kind of a foundation or a baseline would be the incident response plan. And again, this is a document, and it doesn't have to be very long, but it really describes what is your organization going to do when something bad happens. The operative phrase in the cybersecurity world is it's not a question of if, but when, right? So it's not if you're going to get hacked, it's when you're going to get hacked. And so with that mindset, it does, I think, change the thinking. We still want to prevent, we still want to have good practices in place to prevent bad things from happening, but then we also need to have thought around what are we going to do whenever that bad thing does happen. And it doesn't need to be long and sophisticated, but it should be clear in terms of who you're going to contact. Does your current IT provider have the capacity to respond to an incident? Do you need to have somebody else in place? Are there resources maybe that are available through your cyber liability insurance that would help support an incident response plan? What stakeholders maybe on your communications team need to be involved if you have to do a notification to your stakeholders? I think that was a challenge that many organizations that were affected by the Blackbaud breach, had to scramble. They had to figure out, okay, their database of 50,000 users was exposed. How are they going to communicate? What are they going to say? What do they need to say to those stakeholders? And so if you're able to at least run through some of those scenarios ahead of time, can help you fill out those gaps. So when you do have to use it for real, there's not so much thinking on your feet. You can have a plan and work through it as opposed to really reacting in that scenario. So that outlines the policy controls and provides, I think, a little bit more context to those survey questions that we're asking. The next piece and element that we talk about is around training. And so I think as an IT professional who loves lots of shiny tools and lots of reporting and analytics and endpoint management, I really think that training is the key first step of investing in a technology solution. So again, making sure that your staff are aware of what's going on, are educated and equipped to respond to these cybersecurity threats, I think is a key element in protecting your organization's data and also preventing, financial loss through, these online fraud attempts. So we know that most of the cybersecurity threats are coming from email. And so if we can really focus our training and tools and protection around reducing those email threats, then we get a lot of value out of that. So we have some training resources that are available that we've done for free that are on our YouTube channel. So there's an end user security awareness training, and there's some other resources that you can walk your staff through. Our best practice is to use an online training platform called KnowBefore, and this is the framework that we use in terms of the education and awareness for a standard cybersecurity training plan. And so that plan really starts with I put quotes in here for a large annual training. And what I mean by that is not, once a year, everybody goes into the conference room and you have a 1 or 2 hour presentation by somebody up front and everybody sits there and learns about it. But we use through the online training platform typically a 15 to 20 minute training video that talks about a couple of different scenarios, different educational elements, quiz and a survey, to have some interaction. And so that would be something that would be done on an annual basis or as you onboard new staff. So they would go through that training on their own time, within a few days of their employment, or again, if you can do this on an annual basis for your staff. So again, an annual training that that really covers some foundational concepts to give people some awareness of the most likely attacks that they're going to see, how to identify spear phishing, choosing good passwords, good security practices. Those are all common elements of that annual training. The other thing that we like to do is do test monthly phishing. So this gives you a way to measure how well you're doing. So in addition to providing the training, we also want to test and evaluate how well staff are responding to that. And so we do monthly test phishing just to see how things are going. And I have a slide a little bit later on where we can see the effectiveness of that over time. But we found that this rhythm typically works well. And then alongside of that, we're also deploying the ability for staff to report if they have a suspicious message. So again, we want to have a engaged user base that feels like they have tools and they're equipped to identify suspicious messages, and if they're not sure, they have a way to check. So again, that just sends it to our help desk team, and we can evaluate it and head off any potential issues. And then finally, we would say we want to have quarterly micro training. So we don't want IT, cybersecurity training to be something that we do once a year and then we don't really think about it, but we want to keep it in front of people. So on a quarterly basis, then we're typically delivering a 5-minute micro training that's in the form of a game or a quiz. There's even some kind of short form, like videos, like mini series that communicate the concepts in a way that's engaging and educational as well. So we want to keep security in the front of people's minds so that they are constantly aware and vigilant. And then because we have a training system that gives us some reporting and insight, we're able to identify if there's staff that need additional assistance. So, usually there's always a handful of folks that, could use some additional training. Maybe that's one-on-one, maybe that's some additional online training. But again, we want to know where our problems are so that we're able to be proactive about that and address it ahead of time. So now that we've talked about the policy elements, we've talked about the security awareness training and staff education, I think now we kind of get to the technology controls or the tools. And so that's, there's technical pieces that we can implement at your organization to prevent those attackers from getting into your systems. And so those are broadly in 3 different categories. So the first being your identity and account management. As I mentioned earlier, anything you can log into from the web, the bad guys can too. So really focusing controls around that identity is where we want to make that initial investment. We also want to focus on data protection. So because we have that mantra of it's not a question of if you're going to get compromised, but when. So we need to have those reactive protections in place. That means things like backups. So just because you have data in a cloud-based system doesn't mean it's protected in the way that you assume it is. And so I think kind of tying this back to some of the IT acceptable use or data policies, if you as an organization say, hey, we really need to retain data for a year, then you need to make sure that you've got the technology tools in place to support that, because many cloud systems may have a 30-day data retention. So if somebody, if you have a departing staff person, they delete all their files whenever they leave the organization, and then you realize, 60 days later that you need to recover some of that information, it may not be possible unless you proactively put something in place. In the same way, if you need to be able to respond to some sort of a security incident, you need to have the security tools in place that'll allow you to do logging and reporting and analytics before that incident actually needs to be reacted to. So again, data protection is really important because we've gotten, I think, rather lax in our shift to the cloud, where we haven't needed to be as deliberate about planning around that data protection as when the server was in the hall down the office and we had the backup tapes and somebody was swapping them and taking them home and kind of being diligent. Moved to the cloud, we kind of forgot about it. But I think that's a mistake, and we need to be intentional around the protection that we have around not only the backups, also folder permissions. Maybe there's some encryption that needs to be put in place on either files or on the desktop computer, so that if, again, something is lost or stolen, you're not going to disclose information about your constituents. And then the final element here is really on the device protection. And so, the device protection really being focused on elements of updates and patching. So, if you follow us on Twitter, we see we tweet about, hey, have you rebooted your computer this month? It's kind of basic, but making sure that your computer is up to date with the most recent security patches is a very good security practice. It's low cost. If you're in a Microsoft world, it happens automatically. If you're in the Mac OS world, you may need to be a little bit more intentional around installing those updates, but restarting your computer allows those things to be installed completely, and then that protection is applied to your computer. The same thing goes for third-party applications. So in addition to the operating system updates, the third-party apps need to be updated as well. And then also you need to have antivirus on your computer to make sure that you've got that extra layer of protection in place. For us as a managed service provider, we have reporting to make sure that all of this stuff is happening so that we can verify that updates are installed, antivirus is up to date. And again, so unless you're able to do those things, there'll be gaps in the system. So again, those three elements of the technology piece is really around your identity and account management, data protection, and then also device protection.
Thank you for joining Community IT for this podcast, Part 1. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits. Listen for Part 2 in your podcast feed.
Community IT does these free webinars and podcasts for our community, and we love sharing our knowledge and experience. If you have more questions or are having trouble with your IT at your nonprofit, please get in touch with us on our website, www.communityit.com, so we can start a conversation or schedule an assessment. Downloading any of our free resources there will get you signed up for our webinar reminders, and you can attend our next webinar in real time and ask our experts your own questions. If you love podcasts, please subscribe and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits.